Cool. Okay, so I wanted to do a stream, I guess, kind of talking about technical blog writing and walking through the anticipation. Sorry, I'm getting three media streams at the same time. It's quite distracting. I probably need to turn them off. So I wanted to talk about technical blog writing and sort of walk through some of the process and answer any questions and stuff like that. So there is actually a thing that I need to write, which is an article for Real Python. The topic's already been selected, so that kind of makes my life a bit easier. Somebody suggested the topic, a tourist guide to the C, Python, and source code. So I'll talk about, I guess, how we're going to try and make that into an article in a bit. But if you're new to technical blog writing, or you want to start writing a blog, or you've done a bits and pieces with a blog, then I guess we can just talk about like different types of blogs you can write and how you would construct each type. So first on my list, I guess, was picking a topic. So, I think the main thing with this is that your topic can be any number of things. It can be like a how-to blog, like how to build this particular type of project, or it can be like a deep dive into a particular subject or topic, or it could just be a high-level narrative over like a particular subject, like for example, comparing different platforms or different tools that you might want to use. So those are really like the three different types of articles I see in different spaces. And I think the important thing is really to decide on what you want the outcome to be in one of your articles. So I'll give you some examples on some of mine. Okay, so this is one example. So modifying the Python language in 6 minutes. So this originally started off as an article where I wanted to understand how the Python compiler worked. And I thought that a good way to do it would be to basically try and change the syntax in Python. I had absolutely no idea how to do that. So basically this article ended up being lots and lots of research, some ideas, and then basically learning as I'm going, and then I was developing the article basically at the end. So in the article, and I'll talk a bit more about narrative in a second, basically what I wanted to do was to explore like how you can modify the Python language and then step through in basically I saw it as like different levels. So in terms of the structure of the article, I've called them levels 1 to 6, and basically kind of layered the whole article. So it takes you down sort of thread, almost if you're the reader, you're basically the one actually like following the code down through the process. And that's how I kind of decided to structure the article. In terms of the research for this, I'd probably say I spent maybe 2 days, not like full days because I actually have a full-time job, probably about 2 days worth of time researching and playing around with stuff to get something basic going. And then once I'd kind of got all of that information and done all the hard work and the research, actually sitting down and writing the article probably didn't take that long. I'd say about maybe 3 hours to actually sit and write this one. This is only a 6-minute read. It's a fairly short piece. So this is, I guess, one type of narrative where you're basically taking the user on, the reader, sorry, not the user. You're taking them on like a little journey through a system. So if you can kind of picture it in your head, then you're walking them through the different levels in the Python compiler. And the reason I wanted to pick modifying the Python language instead of just how does the Python language work is it can be quite... I think it's easier to understand some topics and really grasp them if you're able to just tweak things and not make massive changes. I mean, the language change I made in this article is really crude. All I'm doing is adding a ++ increment basically to integers, to the integer type, and you can already do +=1 in Python. So basically all I was doing was creating like a shorter hand way of doing that. And talking the reader through that kind of process. So that's one style of article. This one's very different, so I won't talk about that one. This is more a by example tutorial. So basically, there's lots more code snippets on here, and basically it's a lot more sort of diagrams with images and code snippets. And I'll talk a bit more about how I think is the best way to lay them out. By no means this is the correct way. I mean, different people have different styles, I guess. But you can probably see in this article, I'm trying to minimize the amount of English text that I'm using and just focus on the code snippets. And that's because if I think the reader has found an article that says Azure pipelines with Python by example, they're expecting examples. They're not expecting me to monologue for 20 paragraphs at the top of the article. They're just thinking, okay, just give me the code so I can copy and paste it into my project and get it working. However, I think instead of just having a dump of code in this article, I thought it would be more useful to give some background to people and tell them the extra stuff they might need to do. So, for example, how do you select the operating system that your build runs on in Azure? How can you reuse templates across jobs? And then like how to get test output working and stuff like that. So this is a bit of a different style of article in that I'm trying to give practical examples. And with coding articles, you typically want practical examples that include code snippets, which definitely can be a challenge because trying to keep code snippets short is really difficult. By the way, if anyone has any questions, please just stick them in the chat. I've got my iPad running on the side, so I can answer any questions as we go. So that's, I guess, another type of article. Now, I can give you another one. This is a listicle, which is another easy thing to write. So, and also they typically do really well, listicles. So basically just like if your article starts with a number, and it's 5 things or 5 ways to do X, Y, Z, then these articles tend to do really well because it implies to the reader that it's going to be a quick read. And people don't, if the name of the article implies that it's going to take them an hour to read it or it's going to be like a big investment in their time, I find that the readership is a lot lower. And also, even if it is a short read, people aren't going to click on it. So that's another thing. If you're just trying to write clickbait, that's a separate issue. But these types of articles are quite fun to write because they're quick and easy. Do you find different publishing platforms better, worse for handling code samples within content? Yeah, I do actually. So this is Medium. Medium is, so you can do, if you're writing a Medium article, if I just create a new story, you can just use backticks in Medium and then basically start writing code like this. And it just changes it to monospace. But it doesn't do any syntax highlighting or anything like that. So basically the best way to do it is to set up a gist or gist, and then basically just like copy the URL and stick it in the article. Oops. And then Medium will automatically embed the syntax highlighting and stuff in the article. So Medium's pretty good at doing that. I know that WordPress, has got a whole bunch of features for doing this as well. Real Python have got their own content management system. So for that, I use Markdown for doing all the embedding and stuff. It's pretty important to get syntax highlighting in code samples because otherwise they're really hard to read. And I find it really difficult reading articles where people have just dumped a whole load of code and it's all in the same color, and it just looks really foreign and you've got to spend ages trying to figure out what's going on. So yeah, that's hopefully answers that question. Okay, so this is another type of article which is really about narrative, and then this one is basically trying to answer a question. So as you go through the article, it keeps coming back to the question at the top of the article, which is why is Python slow? So basically, the way the article is written is trying to answer the question, but in a way that basically I'm talking out loud in the article as I'm writing it. So I'm kind of explaining some basic concepts, and then I'm testing various theories. So I'm assuming that the reader at the top of the article doesn't know the answer, otherwise they wouldn't click on it. But there are definitely some cases where people think they know the answer and then they're reading it just to see if I'm right or wrong. And then they'll quite gladly tell me in the comments, which is fun. So basically, these are different theories for why Python might be slow, and then I'm questioning those. So you probably see in the article, because it's a question article, I've used lots of question marks in the subtitles, because basically, I think pretty much all of them actually I've used question marks in the subtitles, and that is because it's more kind of like an inquisitive article where you want the reader to be questioning things and not just assuming. And I found this one really fun to write because people have a lot of assumptions about why Python in particular is slow. So it kind of picks apart that theory. So those are the different types of narratives that I normally stick with. Now, the article that I've got to write is going to be a fun one. So somebody suggested this, and this is a tourist guide to the CPython source code. So basically, what I think they're looking for is, if you were to read the CPython source code, like what does it all mean, what's in the different folders, so this is not. The fact that they've used the word tourist in the request, I thought was interesting, because it implies that they want to be, I guess, a tourist just looking at stuff. They're not necessarily like interacting with it and stuff. So I think the person who requested this is implying that they just want a guide to the source code where they don't have to modify anything or change anything. But the more I think about this, and more I think that's going to be really difficult to write in a way that's going to be engaging, because there's different ways I could write this. Let me go and bring up the actual source code. That's probably going to be more useful. Okay, so this is the actual CPython source code. On the left-hand side, I was actually editing some stuff, so that's why I've got a whole bunch of files open. But in the folder structure, there's like loads of folders. I know largely what most of them are for, but if I wrote the article just like going through each folder and saying, this is what's in the build directory, this is what's in the doc folder, this is what's in the grammar folder, I don't know, I just feel like that would be quite boring to read, and it would end up just being like a list. And also the order of the folders doesn't necessarily make any sense. Like grammar, for example, is like this high level basically description of the Python grammar, which gets interpreted by another file. Tokens is like basically all the different characters that can happen in a Python source file. Includes just like a whole bunch of C include files. So that's kind of a challenge. And again, it comes back to narrative. So I did make a list of like headings that I thought would make sense in terms of how to structure the article. And something else I think is really important is if you assume that the reader is a beginner, then you're basically trying to slowly get more in-depth or more complicated as the article goes on. And the point is not to show off how much you know about a particular topic. The point is to teach them something. So in this case, what am I actually trying to teach the reader? Because the CPython source code is really complicated. Some of these files I've looked at before are just like insane. Like I've got absolutely no idea what this does. Safe left shift. I'm guessing that's like a left shift binary operation for a Python object. I don't know why it would be safe. I guess that's maybe a modulus operation or something. But if I just wrote down names of functions and stuff in an article, that's going to be extremely boring to read. So I guess it kind of comes back to, what do you want the objectives of the article to be? Like once the person has read it, what learning objectives do you want them to get out of it? And I think I did kind of write down some already. I think this one's pretty ambitious. Read and understand large chunks of the CPython source code. That implies that you know Python pretty well. Most of CPython is written in Python, actually, not written in C, which is weird, because most of the standard library is written in Python, and the core stuff is written in C. So I think that is implying that the reader has already got. Oops, what happened there? That implies the reader's got a good understanding of C. Otherwise, they're not going to understand large chunks of it. So I think that's ambiguous. Be able to compile CPython. I mean, it's one thing to just read it, but I think it'd be quite useful if the reader could run some commands in their machine and get like a build of CPython running. I think that'd be quite cool, if they've actually built something out of this. Otherwise, it's just the article's really passive. Like they're not actually achieving anything at the end other than just reading stuff. And if people just read things, they're not necessarily going to retain any of it. I thought the test suite was important because if you're going to contribute to Python, you definitely need to know how the test suite works. Read and navigate the code. That should probably go at the top, actually, because I'd say that kind of comes first. You need to know at least where to start. And then I kind of put an ambitious one here, which was modify, upgrade components of the CPython library. That's probably the wrong word. With the intention of raising a pull request. So I thought, well, maybe if one of the outcomes of this article is that you're not necessarily a tourist, but you're reading this and you're understanding it, and one of your outcomes is to say, actually, this is not as complicated as I thought it was. Maybe I could make a change to, I don't know, one of the standard library modules, for example, like, I don't know, the anti-gravity module. I mean, it's not, I think it's pretty simple what this one does, which is pretty funny as well. I don't know why this is in here. The geohash using the Monroe algorithm. Must be some sort of inside joke, this one. So yeah, that's kind of, I guess maybe another learning objective could be that the reader feels some level of confidence that by the end of this article they can, make some changes to some of this, or they can see like a bug or an issue. So the only changes I've ever made to CPython have been like writing tests, and I think that's a fairly easy way to start with CPython because tests are fairly low risk. The core developers are more likely to merge them in because you're basically helping making the platform more stable, and also it gives you a good level of understanding about what's actually in the source code. So I think that's probably another way of doing it. So I guess that's kind of where I've got up to in this article at a high level in terms of what I want to be in here. The headers, I'm not wedded to these, but real Python typically asks you to have an introduction, and in the introduction you basically like try and make sure the the reader sticks with you, and they're basically you've got to sell them the article in the top, in like the first couple of paragraphs. So are they going to actually stay and read the whole thing, or are they just going to click off it? So you've basically got the first couple of paragraphs to kind of convince them that this is a worthwhile read. In terms of my process, I normally write that at the end. I normally write like a high level at the beginning, just so that I know what it is I'm aiming to do. And then the conclusion, obviously, I'll leave to the end. Although if you're a fan of TDD, maybe you want to write the conclusion first. So in terms of the layout, this is what I was thinking. I thought we could go through sections. So kind of explain why CPython written in C and not in Python. What does a compiler do? And what's in the source code. So I thought it would be good because, I mean, if you're coming into this, you might not even know that the standard library is part of the same source repository as the compiler, for example. Like most people might not know that. And then what does the compiler do? I think would be most people know technically what a compiler does, but like actually unpacking what that means. And then I thought it would be useful to walk through Python grammar, because if you're a Python developer, you probably recognize most of the stuff that's going on in here. But it's actually fun to look at the grammar file because it basically is a single document that explains the entire language in a way that's human readable and machine readable. So this is quite a fun file to look at. And it's also one you can modify. So I think when you're looking at language changes, you understand that like a global statement includes the word global and a name. And in Python, a name is basically like, a variable. An assert statement is an assert, and a test statement is basically saying like, does this equal that thing, or does that not equal that thing? So test basically is defined here. So there's different types of test, like an if or an else. So you can basically put things in there, or it can be a lambda definition. So you can actually put lambdas and tests. So stuff like that, like it's kind of fun to read, I think, that file. So that's what I was thinking, was to explain the grammar. The Python interpreter process, I thought it would be good to walk through, like, from you typing Python in the REPL and like typing some code and pressing enter, like what happens, and how does that all work, and then base types and the object model. So in the objects folder, we've got, some of the core types and stuff like that. And I thought it would be interesting to walk through some of these. So like the float object, and maybe pick a couple of types that might be easy for people to read. Unicode would be a nightmare. A set, that would be an easy one, or a tuple maybe. So like explain what's in here and why. Not to walk through line by line, that would just be incredibly boring. So yeah, that's what I was thinking with this one, is base types, and then the standard library. So talk about what's in the lib folder, and then the tooling. So there's like a whole bunch of other folders that have got tools for doing builds and compiles and tests and stuff. And then there's a test suite, which is a behemoth. So like, how does that work? And then lastly, like making changes, creating a fork and stuff like that. So I guess the goal with the article, if we go back to the beginning, is with the intention of being able to make a change to the CPython code, or at least like understanding how it works. So yeah, that's kind of where I've got up to on this one. The difficulty I've got is talked about narrative, because you should have something you should have some thread that takes the reader from the top to the bottom. And the problem I've got just thinking about this article is that I'm not sure what that thread is, because at the beginning it's quite passive, like you're just basically reading stuff, and at the end it's you're actually looking at changing things and modifying stuff. So I'm thinking whether we could pick an example or something that maybe let's look at how we modify this particular thing, and maybe that's what we look at the beginning. So how does, I don't know, we could pick on, I thought about tuples, maybe we could just pick on tuples or something as being the thing that we explore. So what I thought I would do is use a coggle, which is just like a brainstorming article. So in terms of the narratives, there's a couple of ways of doing this. You could use an analogy. So in a recent article, which has not been published yet, the narrative throughout this is trains, and basically train lines and how they relate to complexity. So I've kind of picked a fictional narrative for this one. In some other ones, then the narrative could be like a project. So in the testing posts that I did, we kind of walked through like a basic sample at the beginning. Where is it? So in this one, I introduce some really crude stuff at the beginning, but then basically start to introduce like a test case and a test class, and then use that same snippet of code to evolve the narrative over the article. So it all kind of links back into what I was trying to do, which is just check that if you sum numbers together, and then it actually gives the right result. So that's like the first third of the article, I think, is coming back to that same principle, and taking them all the way back to literally just writing an assert statement and not using a test framework. So that's kind of how that one works. And I think with this article, it would be important to have some kind of narrative that flows through, whether that was a fictional one like the train example. And I was wondering about whether there was something to do with being a tourist, maybe that you could pick on, or I was also thinking about the internals of an actual real python. And I found a really cool picture of like a snake skeleton. And I thought maybe I could use that as being, like an analogy that if you wanted to understand like reptiles and snakes, then, here's the different parts of the animal that you would study and how they relate to, the head, for example, could be like the grammar, and the body of the snake could be like the standard library or something. I don't know what the tail would end up being, maybe the test suite. So yeah, that was another option. So this is kind of where I've got to with this post. Hopefully that's given you some background. So narratives, again, I was picking on the sort of snake analogy. And then another one would be to pick like a practical thing to change or explore. The problem with that is that if I picked, for example, tuples, then that doesn't carry you through to the standard library. So I'm not sure how I'm going to do that one. Another one would be maybe a change to the standard library, like adding a new module or something. I thought that'd be cool. And then maybe something else you could do would be to like write a test case or a test suite or something. That would be fairly easy and straightforward to set up. So yeah, those are, I guess, some narratives that I could pick on. In terms of the snake analogy, I guess that would be like the parts of the snake, like I was saying. So like the head is the, I guess, the like how Python code is input into the system, interpreted, and then like the body would be like the standard library, because without the standard library, Python doesn't really do a great deal other than the core types. And you've got, I guess you've got the core types in there as well. And I don't know about the tails, I just put a question mark there. So those are, I guess, is my decision on the narrative. Potentially I could do both. That's kind of what I'm thinking, is to do kind of both. And the reason I'm talking about narrative so much, sorry, is that I think this is really important. I did actually have a look on the dev guide, because I wanted to see what resources were available, and it's not working. Okay, here we go. So this is the current resources. So if you're a reader and you want to understand the CPython source code, then this is what's available to you right now. So, I mean, one thing is just to test that this actually works. So it's saying, go on GitHub and clone the source code. Okay, I've done that. Let me just, like, I know that works. Okay, first of all, I can see that it's going to clone it into a subdirectory. And they're assuming that the user knows how to, assuming that the user knows to change that directory in the first place. Okay, another bonus thing here is that I know from experience that this won't work very well, because you're not actually compiling with OpenSSL support. And if you don't have OpenSSL support, then pip doesn't work because it requires HTTPS. So, I mean, if you're a new user and you just follow this tutorial, you're basically going to fall into a massive pit of hell in about half an hour. Okay, on Windows, use PC build, blah, blah, blah. I'm not on a Windows machine, so I don't know whether that works. I would assume that you need Visual Studio or at least some of the Windows SDK to get a lot of that stuff running. Run the tests. Okay, this one is a challenging one. Also, something really confusing is that when you compile Python from source on a Mac, it calls the executable python.exe until you run make install, and then it renames it properly. So again, that's really confusing. Something else I don't know about this page is whether this is recent, because I mean, it doesn't have a date on here. Python's been around for a long time, and there's a lot of changes that happen regularly. And it's mentioning Python 2.7. So I guess this article applies to like every version of Python, which is really not specific. So actually, that's a good point. So I need to make a note. So I think that's really important, is to actually say which version of Python, because if I at least stick with the version, there are some challenges, like once a new version comes out, my article is immediately out of date, but I can probably manage that myself. Okay, let's see what else they've put in here. Create a new branch where your work for the issue will go. If an issue does not exist, create it. Trivial issues do not require an issue to be created. Push the branch in your fork, create a pull request. Okay, and then sign the CLA. So, I mean, it sounds simple. Okay, what else have they got in here? Status of Python branches. Okay, what? There is actually a 3.8 branch. No, there's a tags for 3.8, but that's fine. Okay, contributing. And I remember there being some stuff down here for like what's in the source code, which I can probably talk about. Resources, here we are. Exploring CPython's internals, changing the grammar and the design of the compiler. So let's just flick open some of those. So I mean, that's it. Like, that's the resources that are available at the moment. The official ones anyway. It's pretty minimal. So I mean, it says that you've got modules. This, like, the source code is in the modules folder. The Python libraries are in here, and then the tests are in libtest, and the documentation is in the doc library folder. If the module doesn't have a Python file, then it's probably just in the modules folder. And for the built-in types, they're in the objects folder, which we've talked about earlier. For built-in functions, the typical layout is to have them in the Python directory, and then it hasn't actually mentioned like the core stuff, unless I'm missing something. So like the AST and like all the core stuff for Python is in here as well. So like the compiler and the codecs and frozen types and stuff like that is all in there. Where was I? Okay, and then they've linked to some resources that you might want to read. The AST documentation, so that's interesting. Oh, this one caught my eye. Okay, first of all, it's for 3.5, which is not that old, but async IO is not applicable for us. Coding patterns, it might be useful. Python innards might be quite interesting. Python internals. But I mean, these are for older versions of Python, and a lot's changed to 3.1 at least. This is Guido's one, which I was really optimistic about, kind of coming into here. But there's like chapter 1, getting to the prompt, which is interesting. Like, it talks through, like, it's pretty low level. Like, it talks through like the tokenizer and how you get from the prompt in the REPL, and then it kind of ends. He wrote this. When did he write this? It doesn't tell you in here. So yeah, I think that's, in terms of background research, this ceval this one's like all about the eval, like how that works. And then there's some pictures of skincare. I don't know, this one looks actually more relevant. Okay, there's like a dialogue here, some code objects. There's probably some good resources in here. But they're separate articles, like in a series. So that's a bit of a challenge, I think, for the reader in terms of knowing where to start and which order to read them in. Should I read the oldest one first, or I don't know. And then again with this one, like, where do you start? I'd say this is more for like advanced readers. And then what else did I have on my tabs? Changing the grammar. I've actually done this before, and I did not find this page helpful. It fails to mention some really important stuff, which I should probably raise a pull request instead of moaning about it. And then the design of the compiler, like how that works and what an AST is, memory management, how the reference counting, it doesn't actually explain how it works, but it talks about it. And then the parse tree, control flow graphs, bytecode, and code objects. So this is actually probably one of the better pages, which I'm just going to bookmark. So yeah, that's kind of what resources we've got so far. So what did I get to? Does anyone have any questions? The chat's still open. No? Okay. Cool. So I'm going to pick this is challenging. I think maybe starting off with something practical to change, like something, instead of just trying to pick one thing, because the problem is if I pick one thing for people to modify, then it needs to apply to like all of the folders, which I can't really think of anything that applies to Python objects, modules, lib. That would have to be something really complicated. So maybe I might pick two things, like understanding how tuples work. I think understanding core types will be interesting. Let me just close my door, sorry. Hold on. Okay, now I'm going to actually get writing because I've just been waffling for 40 minutes. Okay, so what do we actually want them to have as an outcome? Read and navigate the source code, read and understand large chunks of the source code. That's basically saying the same thing. Compile CPython from source, run the test suite model, upgrade components to the library with the intention of raising a pull request. Yeah, I think that's fine for now. Introduction, why is Python written in C and not in Python? I will come back to that question. What does the compiler do? Those are kind of background things I don't need to do right now. And what's in the source code. So probably just to start off by sketching on the coggle, like what's in, instead of just trying to write this stuff out, I find it easier just to draw it out first and then see what layouts might make sense. So you've got documentation, you've got grammar, what else do we have? Includes, but I mean, that's just this. So the PC folder is for Windows stuff, and the Mac folder is for Mac OS stuff. Standard library, modules, core, core type definitions. And what else is in here? The test suite. And the compiler. Okay. And some build tools and stuff. So that makes sense. What else is in the outline? The Python grammar. Okay, so like let's explore what that means. That'll be a fun one to write. Interpreter process. Base type, standard library. Okay, cool. I think I've got everything I need now to actually sit down and write this. I'm not going to record me sitting and typing because it's not very interesting. I just wanted to explain, I guess, how this works. In terms, I made some other notes as well. The length and the structure of the code snippets. So I really try and keep the code snippets as short as possible. Like a single function would be ideal. Probably 20 lines of code, I'd say, would be the maximum for a code snippet, which actually makes it really challenging because in this article in particular, I'm going to be talking about some stuff which is quite complicated. So I'm probably going to just pick on a section of code to include or a little snippet to include, and then reference the reader back to the, where they can go and get the full detail. And the reason is because if you get to an article, I don't know, some of these probably have some examples. I don't want to pick on anyone else's pages, but I don't know, let's say I included this in my post. I mean, it's going to take up a massive amount of space on the article. And also it's quite daunting looking at it to the reader, and they've got to understand and basically sit there and read what's going on. And it's far easier to explain that in English than it is in code and sometimes. And also there's probably not much point to including all of this stuff. So I think in terms of the code snippets, I try and really keep them as short as possible. So 10 to 20 lines of code is really ideal. The length and structure, okay, time boxing. So what time is it now? It's 9:45. I'm going to give myself 2 hours to work on this. And then I'm going to stop. And I think that's really important because you can spend hours and hours and hours working on stuff, but if you step away and come back to something, I find that you come at it with a fresh mind. And you normally get to the point where you just get so tired that you just slow down and are not particularly productive. So I normally time box stuff and then try and minimize distractions. So shutting off social media and stuff like that is really important in trying to reduce the number of notifications I've got going on in the background. I think it's important as well. And then I'm going to note here about rabbit holes or rabbit warrens, depending on what you used to calling it. So in this article, I mean, I could probably get stuck on any number of these things. John Fincher. How much revision editing do you do on the fly as you write? Actually minimal. So what I normally do is I'd just go and just type until I've written down more or less what I want to say. And then I'm constantly looking at the preview to see like how it looks visually. I know that sounds really silly. Let me pick on one of mine so I don't. Oh, that's not been merged yet, has it? So basically just like looking how the article looks in here. And then once I've done like the rough pass, then I'd go, you're saying you edit as you write, and then doing multiple edit passes as I go. I find that if I do that too much, then I kind of get stuck on a section, and I can spend way too much time on one particular chapter. So that's a bit of a challenge. Yeah, visual inspection is important. You constantly got to go back to like, what does this article look like? Like if you just stand back and squint, does it look like a wall of text? I mean, I'm probably zoomed in. I think that's probably why I'm not. But like there's a lot of text here. But I've used some bold and stuff like that to lay it out. And then there's loads of code samples. So visually, like what does it look like is really important. But I try not to do too much revision and editing when I'm writing. I try to just get as much out as I can. Because if I'm writing a narrative, then I tend to forget quite a lot if I leave it a few days. So yeah, just try and get as much down as possible. I made a note about rabbit holes. So I don't know, any one of these things I could get stuck on, like the Lexa or the parser. Like for example, I mentioned that the article on the website, like the getting started thing, I don't know, like if I just copy that code, this is what the user would do, right? They would go to the folder and they would just like copy and paste that command and press enter. Like what's going to happen? Now, like I was saying, I know from experience that, well, first of all, if you change that to J2, then it's going to be a lot faster, and then do -S. So it's a lot less verbose in the output. I think that was why. But like that's not going to compile with SSL support. So I could spend hours trying to figure out why SSL is not working, why is pip not working, because you can't install any packages. So like you can't, I don't know, you can't install requests or IPython or, I mean, I could spend like 2 hours trying to figure out why SSL is not working. And that's not relevant to the article, but it's really important. So I find with those kind of issues, and this applies to development as well. Like if I spend more than 20 minutes, maybe half an hour on one single issue or problem, then I just stop and basically just put it to one side and move on to something else. Because I've made this mistake many times in the past where I will just sit there for 6 hours trying to do something until I'm just getting sick and tired of it and I can't see the wood for the trees. And it's not helpful. Like if you step away and you come back to something, I find that you can be a lot more productive. Okay, the necessary bits to build these optional modules were not found. _SSL. So surprise, like that's not going to work. So if I just do, I don't know, requests. Oh, okay. Well, first of all, there's no module called pip. So yeah, you've got to figure out like why isn't that working? Because I've just run make, so I don't know, like it's missing a whole bunch of stuff. Anyway, so yeah, not to spend too much time stuck on one particular issue. So time boxing it to maybe half an hour, and just being strict with yourself, like looking at the clock. The last thing I had on the list was audience, timing, and publishing. So I guess, like, this article is really tricky because this is like, I think a lot of people are going to be curious, and a lot of them are going to be like, it's always safe to assume that like the majority of people are beginner level, and they're going to be curious about like how does CPython work, but some of it's pretty complicated. So I think in terms of the audience, my thinking on this one is that it's people who are curious and they want to have a look, but if I can convince them to make changes to the CPython or contribute something, that's awesome. Like that would be first prize, but second prize would be like they just feel a bit more confident that it's not that complicated. So I guess my intention here is to demystify. I should probably write that as an objective. That's not really a learn to, but I'll figure that out later. That would basically be what I'm intending. So in terms of audiences, once this article's done and published, I mean, real Python, the SEO in real Python is insane. So I don't really have to worry too much about people finding it. But if I'm posting stuff on Medium, I put it on Hacker Noon, which is pretty easy to do actually. If you've done a couple of technical articles, you can just bring it to their attention, and they will invite you to be an editor. If you're posting on Medium, I find the SEO is pretty strong anyway. So in terms of timing, US West Coast is really where I get a lot of traffic. But also a lot of people on social media post over there. So I tend to time the articles for about 4 a.m. my time, which would be like lunchtime or something in the US. And definitely on a weekday, not on a weekend. So Monday is normally a pretty good day, and Tuesday is normally a pretty good day to share an article for the first time. So that's typically what I do for timing, is to aim for about midday on a Monday or on a Tuesday for the US West Coast time. And then also repost and reshare the same content, typically around sort of early morning for Western European time zones. So people in, the UK and France and Germany, etc., like trying to get the same article reposted and reshared probably early morning for them. So I tend to find that people will read stuff during the day. In terms of like the readership data, which I've got available to me on this one, so I know like they're all weekends. I recognize those, like the drops are all on weekends, and I pick on, I don't know, this one, because I know this one has done well historically. Okay, so the read ratio is pretty low on this one, but it's a pretty long article, so that's fine. In terms of where I get the traffic from, a lot of it's Medium, because this article went viral. But then Flipboard, people tend to share stuff on social. Reddit, I never find that Reddit performs particularly well. Maybe most you might get through Reddit is about 2,000 with just the Python subreddit. There are some other ones as well, like there's a programming one and things like that. But yeah, I'm not super keen on getting the Reddit channels. And then obviously Google through SEO if you've got enough keywords on the post. So that's kind of what I think. In terms of Twitter, like you can get thousands of retweets, but it doesn't actually equate to thousands of clicks. People tend to retweet stuff without actually reading it. But that can be interesting as well. So yeah, in terms of the audience and stuff like that, Twitter would be one place, Reddit would be another one, just to get things out, and then thinking about the SEO as well, which is why I controversially don't recommend creating your own blog platform. I know lots of people disagree on this one, but the amount of time and effort you have to put into setting it up and getting SEO right, I just don't see it as a good use of time. Like you could just Medium could just turn around and say, we're going to start charging you to do stuff, or they could just take the platform away, but somebody else would come along and offer something similar, and I could just put my content on somewhere else. I don't necessarily want people to go to my website. It's just more stuff for me to do. I really don't have the time to maintain my own website. And the Medium layout looks pretty nice, and you can do quite a lot with it. And then Real Python obviously is another one. They are looking for authors as well. So if you do want to write some technical stuff with Real Python, I'm sure they'd be keen to have you apply. So yeah, that's it really. That's all I had on my list. Was there any other questions on the chat? No? Cool. All right, then I'll wrap it up. Thanks for coming. And yeah, if you have any questions, then just ping me on Twitter or something, and I can probably answer it on there.